Sometimes life's greatest treasures come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. Sometimes the heart knows what it wants before the mind can catch up. In the 1800s West, wealthy widow Eleanor Hawthorne had everything money could buy, but her heart remained empty. That changed the day mountain man Caleb Ironhand McCoy saved her from a runaway horse. This wasn't just any frontiersman. Caleb was known throughout the territory for his strength and his fierce independence. He lived alone in the mountains, avoiding the complications that came with human connection. But Eleanor saw something in him that others missed. After their chance meeting, she shocked him with words that would echo through the valleys. "You should prepare, mountain man, we are having sons." She wasn't asking. She was telling him they were going to build a life together in the wilderness. What happens when two souls, scarred by loss and loneliness, dare to believe in love again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the main street of Copper Ridge, painting the dusty thoroughfare in shades of amber and gold. Eleanor Hawthorne stood at her bedroom window, her delicate fingers tracing patterns on the frosted glass as she watched the town stir to life below. At 32, she possessed the kind of refined beauty that turned heads wherever she went. Raven black, hair that caught the light like silk, intelligent green eyes that seemed to hold secrets, and a figure that even her mourning clothes couldn't disguise. But behind her elegant facade lay a restlessness that had been growing stronger with each passing day. 3 years had passed since her husband Edmund's funeral. 3 years since she'd become the wealthiest widow in the territory. Edmund Hawthorne had been a good man, 20 years her senior, who'd built his fortune in dry goods and mining investments. Their marriage had been comfortable, respectable, arranged by her father when she was barely 19. She'd played the part of the dutiful wife, presiding over dinner parties, managing the household staff, and wearing the finest dresses imported from San Francisco. But comfort wasn't the same as passion, and respectability wasn't the same as purpose. The inheritance Edmund left her was staggering. Enough money to live like a queen for several lifetimes, enough to buy anything her heart desired. Yet as she stood in her grand Victorian house with its imported wallpaper and crystal chandeliers, Eleanor felt like a bird in a gilded cage. The townspeople treated her with deference bordering on reverence. The merchants competed for her business, and the unmarried men of means courted her with tiresome persistence. Everyone wanted something from the wealthy widow, but no one seemed to see the woman beneath the title. Her daily routine had become a prison of predictability. Breakfast served on fine china at precisely 8 o'clock, correspondence with lawyers, and business managers at 9. Charitable committee meetings at 10, afternoon tea with the ladies of the social circle at 2. The conversations were always the same. Gossip about who was courting whom, discussions of the latest fashions from back east, and endless speculation about when Eleanor might remarry and to whom. She participated with practiced grace, saying the right things at the right moments, but her mind often wandered to places far beyond the confines of polite society. It was during one of these suffocating social gatherings that Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, had mentioned the mountain. Men who occasionally came to town for supplies. Dangerous ruffians, she'd whispered over her teacup, living like savages up in those peaks. Why, that McCoy fellow came through last week looking like he hadn't seen civilization in months. Gave me quite a fright with those piercing blue eyes. And that awful scar on his hand. Eleanor had listened with unexpected interest, filing away every detail. Later that evening, she'd casually questioned her driver about these mysterious mountain dwellers, learning that they lived solitary lives in the high country, trading pelts and gold for the supplies they couldn't make or grow themselves. The idea of such complete independence, such freedom from society's expectations, fascinated her in ways she couldn't quite explain. 60 miles away, in a log cabin perched on a rocky outcrop overlooking Crystal Valley, Caleb McCoy was beginning his own morning routine. At 35, he stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, with shoulders broadened by years of physical labor and a frame hardened by the demands of mountain life. His dark hair, streaked with premature silver at the temples, fell to his collar, and his beard was neatly trimmed despite his isolation. But it was his eyes that truly defined him, pale blue like glacier ice, capable of warmth when he chose to show it, but more often holding the wariness of a man who'd learned to trust only himself. The scar on his left hand, the one that had earned him the nickname Ironhand, was a reminder of a grisly encounter 3 winters past. He'd walked away from that fight, which was more than could be said for the bear. The scar tissue had healed strong, stronger than the original skin, and his grip was powerful enough to split kindling with his bare hands. It was a practical asset in a life where strength often meant survival. Caleb's cabin was a testament to self-reliance and careful craftsmanship. Every log had been cut and shaped by his own hands, every joint fitted with the precision of a master carpenter. The interior was sparse but comfortable. A stone fireplace that could heat the entire space, handmade furniture built to last generations, and shelves lined with books he'd traded for over the years. He was far from the savage that townfolk imagined. He simply preferred the honest challenges of nature to the complicated duplicity of human society. His daily routine was dictated by the seasons and the practical needs of survival. Winter mornings meant choking the fire, checking his food stores, and planning the day's work. There was always something that needed doing: firewood to split, tools to maintain, traps to check, or hunting to be done. In spring and summer, he tended a small garden and gathered wild herbs and berries. Come fall, he'd make his trek down to Copper Ridge to trade pelts for supplies and endure the stares and whispers of civilized folk who saw him as some sort of exotic curiosity. The truth was, Caleb hadn't always lived this isolated existence. There had been a time when he'd worn a uniform, when he'd answered to commanding officers and fought alongside other men for causes that seemed important then, but felt hollow now. The war between the states had taken more from him than just 4 years of his life. It had stolen his faith in humanity's capacity for goodness. He'd seen too much, done things he tried not to remember, and when the fighting finally ended, he'd found himself unable to settle back into the rhythms of ordinary life. The mountains had called to him like a sanctuary. Here the rules were simple and honest. Work hard, stay alert, respect the land, and it would provide for you. There were no politicians making speeches while sending other men to die. No industrialists growing rich on the suffering of the poor. No society matrons gossiping about their neighbors' private affairs. Just the wind through the pines, the cry of hawks overhead, and the satisfaction of work well done. The trading post at Miller's Creek served as neutral ground, where the mountain men occasionally crossed paths with townfolk. Old Pete Miller, the proprietor, had built his establishment at the confluence of 2 streams, where the main trail to Copper Ridge intersected with the paths leading up to the high country. It was a weathered log building with a covered porch where men could sit and smoke while conducting business. Pete kept a good selection of supplies, didn't ask too many questions, and treated everyone fairly regardless of their background or circumstances. It was Pete who'd first told Caleb about the widow Hawthorne, though not with any romantic intentions. "That woman's got more money than sense," Pete had muttered while measuring out coffee beans, asking all kinds of questions about you mountain boys, what you eat, how you survive up there, probably writing some kind of book for them Eastern ladies to read and get all fluttery about. Caleb had filed the information away without much interest. Rich widows and their curiosities were none of his concern. He had more pressing matters to attend to, like the approaching winter and the repairs his cabin roof needed before the first heavy snows. But fate, as it often does, had its own plans for bringing these 2 unlikely souls together. Eleanor's restlessness was growing stronger with each passing day, driving her to take longer rides into the countryside, seeking something she couldn't name. And Caleb, despite his determined isolation, found himself thinking more often about the trading post conversations, about a world beyond his mountain sanctuary that both attracted and repelled him. Neither of them knew that their paths were about to cross in a way that would change everything they thought they knew about love, courage, and the kind of life worth living. The mountains that had been Caleb's refuge were about to become the testing ground for Eleanor's transformation, and the woman who had everything would soon discover what she'd been missing all along. The stage was set in the vast wilderness of the American frontier, where survival depended on strength, character was forged in hardship, and love, when it came, burned as bright and fierce as a winter fire. The October morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that made Eleanor's heart ache for something beyond the confines of her ordered life. She dismissed her driver again, choosing instead to take her mare, Duchess, on a solitary ride through the countryside. The horse was a spirited chestnut with Arabian bloodlines, a wedding gift from Edmund that had become her most treasured possession, not for its monetary value, but for the freedom it represented. Eleanor had dressed practically for the occasion, or what passed for practical in her world. Her riding habit was made of deep green wool with a matching jacket that accentuated her figure while allowing for movement. Her hair was pinned up beneath a small hat, though rebellious strands had already begun to escape the confines of propriety. She wore her finest riding gloves and carried a small leather satchel containing sketching materials, a hobby she'd recently taken up as another escape from the tedium of social obligations. The trail she'd chosen led northwest from town, following an old miner's path that wound through stands of aspen and pine toward the foothills. She'd ridden this way before, but never quite so far from civilization. Something was pulling her forward today, a restlessness that demanded distance from everything familiar and safe. Duchess picked her way carefully along the rocky path, her breath visible in the cool air. Eleanor let her mind wander as they climbed, thinking about the conversation she'd had with her lawyer the previous week. Mr. Henderson had been discussing investment opportunities, ways to grow her already substantial fortune. But all Eleanor could think about was how meaningless numbers on paper seemed when weighed against the vibrant life she could see surrounding her in nature. The attack came without warning. A mountain lion, lean and hungry as winter approached, burst from the undergrowth with a scream that turned Eleanor's blood to ice. Duchess reared in terror, her hooves flailing at the empty air as the predator's cry echoed off the canyon walls. Eleanor, an accomplished rider, tried to maintain her seat, but the mare's panic was absolute. Duchess bolted down the trail at a dead run, with Eleanor clinging desperately to the reins and fighting to stay mounted. The world became a blur of rushing wind, pounding hooves, and the sick certainty that she was about to die. Tree branches whipped past her face, and loose rock scattered under Duchess's frantic flight. Eleanor could feel her seat slipping with each jarring stride, could feel her carefully pinned hair streaming behind her like a dark banner. The elegant riding habit that had seemed so practical that morning now felt like a costume from another world, wholly inadequate for the raw violence of nature unleashed. It was then that she saw him. Caleb McCoy stepped into the trail ahead of them with the calm confidence of a man who had faced down charging grizzlies. He didn't shout or wave his arms, that would only have spooked the horse further. Instead, he planted himself squarely in the path and waited, his pale blue eyes fixed on the approaching chaos with unnerving steadiness. At the last possible moment, as Duchess bore down on him at full gallop, Caleb moved. His reaction was so smooth it seemed choreographed, a fluid sidestep that brought him alongside the terrified mare. His scarred left hand shot out and caught the bridle just behind the bit, and Eleanor watched in amazement as 200 pounds of panicked horseflesh gradually slowed under the influence of his unshakable calm. "Easy, girl," Caleb murmured, his voice pitched low and soothing. "Easy now, whatever spooked you is long gone." Duchess trembled beneath Eleanor, her flanks heaving and her eyes still wild, but she had stopped. The mountain man's presence seemed to create a pocket of safety in what had moments before been chaos and terror. Eleanor found herself staring down at him, this legendary figure she'd heard whispered about in parlors and coffee shops, and felt something shift deep inside her chest. He was nothing like she'd expected, and everything she'd hoped for without knowing it. His hair was dark with silver threading through it, and his beard was neatly trimmed despite his isolation. But it was his eyes that captured her, pale blue like winter sky, holding depths of experience and wisdom that no drawing-room conversation could match. The famous scar on his left hand was visible where he gripped the bridle, a pale line against sun-weathered skin that spoke of battles fought and survived. "Are you hurt, ma'am?" His voice carried the slight drawl of the frontier, but his words were carefully chosen, educated. This was no simple savage, despite what the town gossips claimed. Eleanor realized she was staring and felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I know, I don't think so. Thank you. If you hadn't—" "Mountain cat," Caleb said simply, scanning the surrounding forest with practiced eyes. "Hungry one, by the sound of it. You're a long way from town to be riding alone." Something in his tone, perhaps the implicit criticism of her judgment, sparked Eleanor's natural spirit. She straightened in the saddle, suddenly very aware that her hat had been lost somewhere during the wild ride, and her hair was tumbling loose around her shoulders. Her riding habit was torn at the sleeve, the fine fabric no match for grasping. "Branches. I can ride wherever I choose," she said, lifting her chin with the imperious grace that had cowed society matrons and intimidated suitors. "I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself." Caleb's expression didn't change, but Eleanor caught the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Yes, ma'am, I can see that." The gentle mockery in his tone should have offended her. Instead, it sent an unexpected thrill through her chest. When was the last time anyone had dared to challenge her, even so subtly? When had anyone looked at her with anything other than deference or calculation? "You're him," she said suddenly, the words spilling out before she could consider their wisdom. "You're Caleb McCoy, Ironhand." His hand tightened almost imperceptibly on the bridle, and for a moment something guarded flickered in those pale eyes. "Guilty as charged, ma'am. And you'd be the widow Hawthorne." It wasn't a question. Eleanor felt a flutter of something that might have been nervousness or excitement. "You know who I am." Hard not to. Word travels fast in small places. He released the bridle and stepped back, clearly preparing to end their encounter. "Your horse should be calm enough now. I'd suggest heading back to town before that cat decides to circle around for another try." But Eleanor wasn't ready for this meeting to end. Something about this man, about the way he'd appeared like a guardian angel at exactly the moment she needed him most, felt like destiny. The very air around him seemed charged with possibility, with the promise of something, real and honest, that her gilded life had never offered. "Wait," she said, swinging down from the saddle with more haste than grace. Her legs were shaky from the ordeal, and she had to steady herself against Duchess's warm flank. "I want to thank you properly. You saved my life." Caleb had already taken several steps back up the trail, but he paused at her words. "No thanks necessary, ma'am. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Eleanor said firmly, moving closer despite the warning in his posture. "Not anyone. Not like that. You have a gift with animals, with dangerous situations. I've never seen anything like it." She was close enough now to see the fine lines around his eyes, the result of years spent squinting into mountain sun and wind, close enough to catch the faint scent of pine smoke and leather that clung to his clothes, close enough to feel the carefully controlled power that radiated from his frame, like heat from a forge. The words came from somewhere deep inside her, from a place she hadn't known existed until this moment. They spilled out with all the force of a revelation, as certain and inevitable as sunrise. "You should prepare, mountain man," she said, her green eyes locking with his blue ones. "We are having sons." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Caleb's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, disbelief, something that might have been panic. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Ma'am, I think that fall might have addled your thinking. My thinking has never been clearer." Eleanor stepped closer still, close enough to see her own reflection in his eyes. "I've been sleepwalking through life, playing the part everyone expected me to play. But this," she gestured between them, encompassing the forest, the rescue, the impossible moment of connection. "This is real. This is what I've been looking for." Caleb took another step backward, but Eleanor could see the struggle in his face. He wasn't unaffected by her words, wasn't immune to whatever was crackling between them like electricity before a storm. "You don't know what you're saying," he said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "I know exactly what I'm saying." Eleanor's tone was calm, matter of fact, as if she were discussing the weather instead of rewriting both their futures. "I know you feel it too. I know you're tired of being alone up in those mountains. And I know that what just happened between us, the way you appeared when I needed you most, the way we're looking at each other right now, isn't coincidence." With that, she turned and swung herself back into the saddle with renewed grace. Her torn riding dress fluttered in the breeze like a banner of rebellion against everything she'd been expected to be. "Think about it, Caleb McCoy," she said, gathering the reins. "Think about what it would mean to build something real together, something that matters. Because I'm going to make this happen, with or without your cooperation." She touched her heels to Duchess's flanks and cantered away, leaving Caleb standing alone on the mountain trail with the echo of her impossible words ringing in his ears. Eleanor returned to her grand house that evening with her mind made up and her heart beating faster than it had in years. She dismissed her housekeeper's concerned questions about her torn dress and disheveled appearance with a wave of her hand, claiming she'd taken a small tumble that was of no consequence. But as she stood before her bedroom mirror, brushing out her hair and examining the small scratches on her cheek from the pine branches, she knew that everything had changed. The woman staring back at her looked different somehow, more alive, more purposeful. Her green eyes held a spark that hadn't been there that morning, and her skin seemed to glow with an inner energy that had nothing to do with the fresh air and exercise. She'd found him. She'd found the man who could give her the authentic life she craved, and she wasn't about to let society's conventions or his own stubborn resistance stand in her way. That night, Eleanor sat at her writing desk by lamplight, sketching a crude map based on what she remembered of the trail where she'd encountered Caleb. She questioned her driver discreetly about the mountain paths, consulted survey maps in Edmund's old study, and pieced together a rough idea of where the mountain man's territory might lie. The map she drew was amateur at best. Shaky lines indicating ridges and valleys, question marks where she wasn't certain of the terrain. But it represented something far more significant than geographic knowledge. It was a plan of campaign, a declaration of war against the comfortable prison of her previous life. 3 days later, Eleanor set out again, this time with a pack containing supplies she hoped would demonstrate her serious intentions. She'd included practical items: dried meat, hardtack, a small cooking pot, and matches wrapped in oiled cloth, alongside offerings that spoke to her understanding of mountain life. A good knife with a bone handle, sewing supplies for mending, and a bottle of quality whiskey that had been gathering dust in Edmund's liquor cabinet. The climb was more difficult than she'd anticipated. The trail, if it could even be called that, wound steeply upward through dense forest and across rocky slopes that tested both her horsemanship and her determination. Duchess, bred for show rather than mountain work, struggled with the terrain, and Eleanor found herself dismounting frequently to lead the mare over particularly treacherous sections. By midday, she was thoroughly lost. The crude map she'd drawn proved woefully inadequate when faced with the reality of the mountain landscape. Every ridge looked similar. Every valley seemed to lead deeper into an endless maze of stone and timber. Eleanor's confidence, so strong when she'd set out that morning, began to waver as the sun climbed higher and her water supply dwindled. It was the smoke that saved her. A thin column of grey rising from somewhere ahead and to her left, barely visible against the clouded sky. Eleanor turned Duchess toward it with relief flooding her chest, pushing through a stand of aspen whose golden leaves whispered secrets in the mountain breeze. Caleb's cabin sat in a natural clearing overlooking a narrow valley, positioned to catch the morning sun, while remaining sheltered from the worst of the winter winds. It was larger than Eleanor had expected, built from massive logs that spoke of both skill and considerable labor. The roof was covered with hand-split shingles, and stone chimneys anchored each end of the structure. A covered porch ran along the front, furnished with handmade chairs and a table that suggested this was more than just a survival shelter. It was a home. The man himself emerged from the cabin as Eleanor approached, his expression unreadable. He'd apparently been working on something, because his sleeves were rolled up and his hands were dirty. The famous axe she'd heard mentioned in town conversations was embedded in a chopping block beside a neat stack of split firewood, its blade gleaming with the patina of constant use and careful maintenance. "Lost?" Caleb asked without preamble, though his tone held more resignation than surprise. Eleanor dismounted, trying to project confidence despite her disheveled state. Her riding habit was dusty from the trail, and her hair had once again escaped. "It's pins. Not lost. Looking for you." "I figured as much." Caleb's pale eyes took in her appearance, the pack tied behind her saddle, the stubborn set of her jaw. "Long way to come for conversation." "This isn't about conversation." Eleanor untied her pack and let it drop to the ground with a satisfying thud. "This is about proving something." "What's that?" "That I'm serious about what I said down on that trail. That I'm not some flighty society woman with romantic notions about frontier life." She gestured toward the cabin, the woodpile, the evidence of careful industry that surrounded them. "I know what this would require. I know it wouldn't be easy." Caleb pulled the axe from the chopping block with an easy motion and set it aside, then turned to face her fully. "You know nothing about what this would require." The bluntness of his response stung, but Eleanor held her ground. "Then teach me." "Teaching and living are two different things, Mrs. Hawthorne. Teaching is what you do with visitors who go home to warm beds and hot meals when the lesson's over. Living is what happens when there's nowhere else to go." Eleanor opened her pack and began removing items, setting them on the porch steps like offerings. "I brought supplies. I can cook, I can mend, I can learn whatever else you think I need to know." Caleb watched her methodical unpacking with something that might have been amusement. "Can you skin a deer? Can you preserve meat for winter? Can you set a broken bone or treat a fever when the nearest doctor is 3 days' ride away?" "No," Eleanor admitted, meeting his gaze squarely. "But I can learn. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I'm not afraid of you." That last statement hung in the air between them, charged with implications neither was quite ready to address. Caleb's expression softened slightly, and for a moment Eleanor caught a glimpse of the man beneath the legend, someone who'd been alone for so long that the possibility of companionship both attracted and terrified him. "Why?" he asked finally. "You've got everything a woman could want down in that town. Money, comfort, people who'd give anything to please you. Why throw all that away for—" He gestured at the wilderness surrounding them. "This." Eleanor considered her answer carefully, knowing that everything depended on making him understand. "Because none of that is real. It's all just performance, playing a role that someone else wrote for me. When I'm down there, I feel like I'm slowly disappearing, like I'm becoming less myself every day." She moved closer, close enough to see the way his jaw tightened, as if he were fighting some internal battle. "But when I'm here, when I'm with you, I feel more alive than I have in years. I feel like the person I was meant to be." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his gaze ranging from her face to the valley below and back again. When he spoke, his voice was gentler than before, but still cautious. Life up here isn't some romantic adventure, Eleanor. It's hard work from sunrise to sunset. It's being cold and hungry and scared, and having to make decisions that could mean the difference between living and dying. It's being cut off from everything you've ever known, with no guarantee that it'll work out the way you're hoping. I know that, Eleanor said quietly. I also know that the alternative is living the rest of my life as half a person, going through the motions while my heart withers away from neglect. She reached for his hand, the scarred one that had earned him his nickname, and was surprised when he didn't pull away. His skin was rough and warm, marked by years of honest labor, and she felt a jolt of recognition pass between them at the contact. I'm not asking you to make any promises, she continued. I'm not asking you to love me or even to want me here. I'm just asking you to give me a chance to prove that this could work, that we could build something together that's worth more than either of us could create alone. Caleb's fingers tightened around hers for just a moment before he stepped back, putting distance between them that felt both necessary and painful. You can stay the night, he said finally, but tomorrow you go back to town. This isn't a game, Eleanor, and I won't be responsible for what happens if you try to make it into one. Eleanor smiled, recognizing the concession for what it was, the first crack in his armor of resistance. Thank you. That's all I'm asking for. One night to show you that I can handle whatever this life requires. As the sun began to set behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Eleanor helped Caleb with the evening chores. She was clumsy at first, unfamiliar with the rhythms of mountain life, but she was determined and quick to learn. By the time full darkness fell, and they sat on the porch sharing a simple meal, something had shifted between them. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it hanging in the clear mountain air, like the promise of dawn. Eleanor woke before dawn, to the sound of Caleb moving around the cabin, his boots soft against the wooden floor as he prepared for the day ahead. She'd spent the night on a simple cot in the cabin's main room, wrapped in blankets that smelled of wood smoke and pine, and despite the unfamiliar surroundings, she'd slept better than she had in months. There was something about the silence of the mountains, broken only by the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant call of night birds, that felt like coming home. Coffee's ready, Caleb said, without looking at her as she sat up and tried to restore some order to her hair. He was already dressed and moving with the efficient purposefulness of a man who'd been awake for some time. Eleanor accepted the tin cup he offered, wrapping her fingers around its warmth and inhaling the rich, bitter aroma. The coffee was stronger than anything served in the parlors of Copper Ridge, black as midnight, and potent enough to wake the dead. Sleep well? Caleb asked, settling into the chair across from her with his own cup. Better than I have in years, Eleanor answered honestly. There's something about this place. The quiet, the clean air. It's like the world makes sense here in a way it never did down in town. Caleb studied her over the rim of his cup, those pale blue eyes taking in details she couldn't guess at. You say that now after one comfortable night, but winter's coming, Eleanor. Up here, winter isn't just cold weather. It's a test of everything you think you know about yourself. Then let me take that test, Eleanor said, leaning forward with an intensity that made Caleb blink. Let me prove that I'm stronger than you think I am. Before Caleb could respond, the sound of breaking branches and a low, ominous growling reached them from somewhere beyond the cabin's clearing. Caleb was on his feet instantly, moving with a fluid grace that spoke of years spent reading danger in the wilderness. He crossed to where his rifle hung on wooden pegs beside the door, checking the load with practiced efficiency. "Bear," he said, quietly, motioning for Eleanor to stay where she was. "Probably after the food cache, stay inside and keep quiet." But Eleanor had no intention of cowering in the cabin while Caleb faced danger alone. She followed him to the window, peering through the glass at the scene unfolding in the grey pre-dawn light. Massive black bear had indeed found Caleb's food storage, a wooden box suspended between two trees to keep it away from scavenging animals. The bear was easily 7 feet tall when it reared on its hind legs, its powerful claws raking at the rope that held the cache beyond reach. Eleanor had seen bears before, but only at a distance, and never one this size. The creature was magnificent and terrifying, a living reminder of the raw power that ruled in this untamed country. "He's hungry," Caleb murmured, more to himself than to Eleanor, "trying to put on weight before hibernation. Can't blame him for that. But I can't let him have my winter supplies either." Eleanor watched as Caleb stepped onto the porch, rifle ready but not yet raised. His movements were deliberate and non-threatening, designed to assert his presence without triggering an attack. The bear dropped to all fours and turned toward the cabin, its small dark eyes fixing on the human who dared to challenge its claim. "To the food. Easy, old fellow," Caleb said, in the same calm tone he'd used with Duchess during the mountain lion incident. "Plenty of salmon in the creek down valley. No need to tear up my stores." The bear huffed and took a step closer, testing Caleb's resolve. Eleanor held her breath, torn between admiration for Caleb's courage and terror at the thought of what would happen if the creature charged. She'd heard stories of what bears could do to men, had seen the scars on trappers who'd been lucky enough to survive such encounters. It was then that Eleanor made a decision that surprised even herself. Moving as quietly as she could, she slipped out the cabin's back door and circled around toward the food cache. If she could create a distraction, give Caleb a better angle, or simply confuse the bear long enough for him to take action, it might make the difference between survival and disaster. She picked up a fallen branch, testing its weight, then hurled it as hard as she could toward a pile of rocks well away from both Caleb and the bear. The crash of wood against stone echoed through the clearing, and the bear's massive head swung toward the sound with startled alarm. In that moment of distraction, Caleb fired a shot into the air. The sharp crack of the rifle sent the bear lumbering away into the forest, crashing through underbrush with surprising speed for something so large. Within seconds, the clearing was quiet again, except for the ringing echo of the gunshot bouncing off distant peaks. "Damn it, Eleanor!" Caleb's voice was sharp with anger as he turned to find her standing beside the woodpile, still holding another branch like a weapon. "I told you to stay inside." "You needed help," Eleanor said simply, dropping the branch and walking toward him with steady steps. "I couldn't just hide while you faced that alone. You could have been killed. Bears move faster than you think, and if he'd charged—" "But he didn't charge," Eleanor interrupted, stopping close enough to see the fear and fury warring in his expression. "And your shot was clean, and we're both fine. We handled it together." Caleb stared at her for a long moment, and Eleanor could see him struggling with conflicting emotions. Part of him was clearly furious at her for taking such a risk, but another part, a part he was trying hard to suppress, seemed impressed by her courage and quick thinking. "You have no idea how lucky we just were," he said finally. But his voice had lost some of its sharp edge. "I know exactly how lucky we were," Eleanor replied. "Lucky to have each other, lucky that you knew how to handle the situation, and lucky that I was here to help when you needed it." She moved closer still, close, enough to see the pulse beating fast at his throat, close enough to catch the scent of gunpowder that clung to his clothes. "This is what I'm talking about, Caleb. This is what I want. To be your partner, not your burden. To face whatever comes together instead of alone." For a moment, something shifted in Caleb's expression. The walls he'd built around himself seemed to waver, and Eleanor caught a glimpse of the man he might have been before isolation and loss had hardened him. His hand reached out almost involuntarily, his fingers brushing against her cheek where a scratch from yesterday's wild ride had left a small mark. "You're not like other women," he said quietly, his voice rough with an emotion Eleanor couldn't quite identify. "No," she agreed, covering his hand with hers and pressing it more firmly against her face. "I'm not. I'm exactly the woman you need, even if you're too stubborn to admit it yet." Caleb's thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, and for one breathless moment Eleanor thought he might kiss her. The air between them seemed charged with possibility, heavy with all the words they hadn't yet spoken and all the promises they hadn't yet made. But then he stepped back, dropping his hand and turning away toward the food cache that the bear had been trying to reach. "Help me check the supplies," he said, his voice carefully neutral again. "Make sure nothing was damaged." Eleanor bit back her disappointment and joined him in examining the hanging storage box. As they worked together in the growing daylight, she noticed the way he moved with unconscious grace, the way his hands were gentle even when checking for damage. She noticed, too, how he'd positioned himself between her and the direction the bear had taken, still protecting her, even as he fought against the growing connection between them. When they'd finished their inspection and confirmed that the cache was secure, Caleb disappeared into the cabin and returned with a folded wool blanket. It was clearly one of his own, worn soft from use and smelling faintly of the cedar chest where it had been stored. "Nights get cold up here," he said gruffly, pressing the blanket into her hands. "Even in early fall. You'll need this if you're planning to keep making these trips." Eleanor accepted the gift with a smile that transformed her entire face. It wasn't a declaration of love or even an admission of interest, but it was acknowledgement, recognition, that she might indeed continue visiting, that her presence here wasn't entirely unwelcome. "Thank you," she said softly, holding the blanket against her chest like a treasured keepsake. "I'll take good care of it." "See that you do," Caleb replied, but there was warmth in his voice now, warmth that hadn't been there before their shared encounter with danger. As Eleanor prepared to ride back to town later that morning, she carried with her more than just a warm blanket. She carried the memory of standing beside Caleb as they faced down a mountain bear, the knowledge that she was braver than she'd ever imagined, and the growing certainty that this stubborn, solitary man was exactly what her heart had been searching for all along. The seed of something real and lasting had been planted between them, watered by shared danger and the recognition of mutual strength. Now it remained to be seen whether that seed would take root and grow into something that could survive the harsh winters of both the mountains and the human heart. Eleanor's visits to the mountain became as regular as the changing seasons, each trip bringing her deeper into Caleb's world and further from the comfortable predictability of her former life. October dissolved into November, and with it came the first serious snows that would test both her determination and Caleb's growing willingness to let her share his solitary existence. She had begun to change, physically and in ways that went far deeper than appearance. Her hands, once soft and manicured, now bore the honest calluses of someone who split kindling and hauled water from the creek. Her face had acquired a healthy glow from mountain sun and clean air, and her figure had grown leaner and stronger from the constant physical demands of frontier life. But the most significant transformation was in her eyes. They held a confidence and purpose that no amount of inherited wealth could have provided. Caleb had begun working on something in the evenings, after the daily chores were done, and they sat by the fire sharing simple meals and complicated conversations. Eleanor had caught glimpses of wood shavings on the cabin floor, had heard the soft sounds of carving coming from the workshop space he'd built adjacent to the main cabin. When she'd asked about his project, he'd deflected with typical mountain man economy of words, claiming it was just something to keep his hands busy during the long winter nights ahead. But Eleanor suspected it was more than that. She'd seen the careful attention he paid to the measurements, the way he selected only the finest pieces of wood, smooth and free of knots. There was a tenderness in the way he handled the project that spoke of something deeply personal, something that mattered more than simple busywork. The truth was, Caleb was carving a cradle. He hadn't intended to start the project. It had begun. Almost without conscious thought, his hands shaping the wood, while his mind wrestled with Eleanor's bold prediction about their future together. Every smooth curve he carved seemed to make her words more real, more possible. Every joint he fitted with meticulous care brought him closer to accepting what his heart had known from that first day on the trail. Eleanor Hawthorne was going to change his life forever, whether he was ready for it or not. The cradle was taking shape beautifully, crafted from mountain maple with a grain like flowing water. The rockers were perfectly balanced, the sides high enough to keep a restless infant safe, the entire piece sanded smooth as silk. It was the kind of work that revealed a man's true character, patient, skilled, hopeful despite himself. Eleanor, meanwhile, was learning to navigate the delicate balance between her two worlds. The townspeople of Copper Ridge had begun to notice her frequent absences, her increasing disregard for social obligations, and her growing indifference to the matrimonial campaigns of eligible bachelors. Mrs. Patterson and her circle of gossips speculated endlessly about the widow's strange behavior. Though none of them suspected the truth, "Eleanor, dear, you missed the ladies' auxiliary meeting again." Mrs. Patterson had cornered her outside the general store, her tone dripping with false concern, "and Dr. Hutchinson was asking after you most particularly. Such a fine man and so well established. I do hope you're not letting grief cloud your judgment about the future." Eleanor had smiled with perfect politeness while inwardly burning with impatience for these tedious social rituals. "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Patterson. I'm quite well, I assure you. I've simply been exploring the countryside, enjoying the autumn weather before winter sets in." "Exploring?" Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows had risen to nearly her hairline. "My dear, surely you don't mean unaccompanied. The frontier is no place for a lady alone, especially with all those rough mountain men about." If only she knew, Eleanor had thought, fighting to keep her expression neutral. If only she knew that one of those rough mountain men was teaching her to read weather signs and animal tracks, to build fires that would burn all night, and to find her way through trackless forest, using nothing but the sun and stars for guidance. It was during one of these visits that Eleanor finally broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind for weeks. She and Caleb were sitting on his porch, watching the first heavy snow of the season blanket the valley in pristine white. The world looked transformed, magical in its winter dress, but Eleanor knew that the beauty masked serious challenges ahead. "I want to stay," she said without preamble, her breath visible in the cold air. "Not just for visits. I want to stay here permanently." Caleb's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. When he looked at her, she could see the war being fought behind. His pale blue eyes, desire battling caution, hope struggling against fear. "Eleanor, I know what you're going to say," she interrupted, turning to face him fully. "It's too dangerous, too difficult, too much of a change. But I've been thinking about this for weeks, and I've made up my mind." She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded document, legal papers that she'd had drawn up in secret during her last trip to town. "I've arranged to sell the house and most of my holdings. I'll keep enough to ensure we have what we need for supplies and emergencies, but the rest—" She gestured toward the valley below, toward the town that no longer felt like home. "The rest is just weight I don't need to carry anymore." Caleb set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, as if sudden movements might shatter the moment entirely. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious about anything in my life." Eleanor's voice held the calm certainty of someone who had wrestled with doubt and emerged victorious. "I've spent the last 2 months learning what it means to really live, Caleb. Every day I go back to that empty house, every social function I attend, every conversation about nothing that matters. It all feels like dying by degrees." She stood and moved to the porch railing, her gloved hands gripping the wood as she looked out at the snow-covered wilderness that had become more home to her than any mansion ever could. "I want to wake up every morning to this view. I want to work beside you, to build something that matters with someone who matters. I want to have your children and raise them to be strong and free and real." Caleb was quiet for so long that Eleanor began to fear she'd pushed too hard, too fast. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. You don't understand what you'd be giving up. Your life in town, the comfort, the security, the respect. Whose respect? Eleanor turned back to face him, her green eyes blazing with conviction. Mrs. Patterson's, Dr. Hutchinson's, people who see me as nothing more than Edmund's widow with Edmund's money. That's not respect, Caleb. That's just polite greed. She moved closer, close enough to see the conflict playing out in his expression. The only respect I care about is yours. The only security that matters is what we build together. And as for comfort, she gestured at the simple porch, the handmade furniture, the life of honest labor that surrounded them. I've never been more comfortable anywhere than I am right here. Caleb stood abruptly, pacing to the far end of the porch, as if he needed distance to think clearly. Winter up here isn't like those crisp autumn days you've been visiting during. It's months of being snowed in, of making every piece of firewood count, of having nothing and no one but each other when things go wrong. Are you prepared for that kind of isolation? I'm prepared for anything, as long as we face it together. Eleanor followed him, her voice growing softer but no less determined. I'm not some fragile flower who'll wither at the first sign of hardship. You've seen me handle danger. You've watched me learn skills I never thought I'd need. I'm stronger than either of us imagined I could be. And if you get sick, if there's an accident, an emergency that needs more than mountain remedies, then we'll deal with it the way people have been dealing with such things for centuries, together with courage and determination and love. Eleanor reached out to touch his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. Life doesn't come with guarantees, Caleb, no matter where you live it. At least here, we'd be living it on our own terms. Caleb turned to look at her then, and Eleanor could see the exact moment when his resistance began to crumble. It was in the way his shoulders relaxed slightly, the way his breath escaped in a long sigh that seemed to carry years of loneliness and caution. You really mean it, he said, wonder creeping into his voice. You'd give up everything for this, for me. Not give up, Eleanor corrected gently. Trade up. Trade a life that was killing me slowly for one that makes me feel alive. Trade loneliness, disguised as society for genuine partnership. Trade playing a role for being myself. She moved closer still, until they were standing so near that the warmth of their bodies mingled in the cold air. I love you, Caleb McCoy. I love your strength and your gentleness, your skill and your integrity. I love the way you see the world, and the way you make me see myself. And I believe I know that you love me too, even if you're too afraid to say it. The words hung between them like a bridge over dangerous water, an offering of truth that demanded an equal response. For a moment, Eleanor feared she'd miscalculated, that his fear would prove stronger than his love. But then Caleb's hands came, up to cup her face, his scarred fingers gentle against her cold cheeks, and when he spoke, his voice held a tenderness she'd only glimpsed in their most unguarded moments. God help me, I do love you, he whispered. I've been fighting it since that first day, telling myself it couldn't work, that I'd only end up hurting you. But you're right about one thing. You're stronger than I gave you credit for. Stronger than I thought anyone could be. Eleanor felt tears of relief and joy begin to freeze on her cheeks, but she didn't care. This moment, this admission, was worth all the cold and hardship that might lie ahead. Then let me stay, she said simply. Let me prove that we can build something beautiful together, something that will last. Caleb's answer was a kiss that tasted of coffee and promise, of surrender and hope intertwined. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard in the thin mountain air, Eleanor knew that her future had been decided not by obligation or expectation, but by choice and love. As if to seal their understanding, Caleb took her hand and led her into the cabin, to the small workshop where moonlight revealed the partially completed cradle he'd been crafting in secret. Eleanor gasped when she saw it, recognizing not just the beauty of the craftsmanship, but the deeper meaning it represented. You've been planning for this, she said softly, running her fingers along the smooth wood. You've been hoping for it, even while you were fighting against it." Caleb nodded, his own hand covering hers on the cradle's rail. "Hearts know things that minds take longer to accept," he said. "Mine knew from the beginning that you were going to change everything. I was just too stubborn to listen." Outside, the snow continued to fall, transforming the landscape into something pure and new. Inside the cabin, two people who had found each other against all odds began to plan for a future that would be built on love, determination, and the unshakable belief that together they could overcome whatever challenges the wilderness might offer. The decision made, Eleanor wasted no time in transforming her declaration into reality. The following week brought a flurry of activity that shocked Copperidge society to its very foundations. Eleanor Hawthorne, the town's wealthiest and most eligible widow, was liquidating her holdings and preparing to disappear into the mountains like some sort of madwoman. The scene at her house was one of controlled chaos as Eleanor methodically sorted through the accumulations of her married life. Items that had once seemed essential, elaborate furniture, delicate china, gowns that cost more than most families earned in a year, now struck her as absurd relics of a life she no longer wanted. She kept only what would be practical in her new existence: sturdy clothing, basic cooking implements, books that had genuine meaning rather than mere decoration, and a few precious mementos that connected her to happier memories. Her wedding ring from Edmund was among the items she chose to leave behind. Standing in her bedroom on a grey December morning, Eleanor worked the gold band from her finger, where it had rested for 13 years. It came away easily, as if it too recognized that its time had passed. She held it for a moment, remembering the young woman who had accepted it with dutiful gratitude rather than passionate love, then placed it carefully in a velvet-lined box that would go to Edmund's nephew, along with most of the other family heirlooms. The ring had represented obligation, social expectation, a life lived according to other people's plans. What she was choosing now represented freedom, authentic love, a future built on her own terms, with a man who saw her as she truly was, rather than as she appeared to be. The legal arrangements proved more complex than Eleanor had anticipated. Mr. Henderson, her lawyer, had initially refused to proceed with what he termed financial suicide disguised as romantic folly. It had taken 3 heated meetings and the threat to find new legal representation before he'd grudgingly agreed to execute her wishes. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he'd pleaded during their final session, "I implore you to reconsider. Frontier life has broken stronger people than yourself. What will you do when this mountain man abandons you for someone younger? What will you do when the money runs out and you have nothing left to fall back on?" Eleanor had looked at him with the serene confidence of someone who had discovered her true purpose. "Mr. Henderson, I have lived the last 13 years with every material comfort imaginable, and I have never been more miserable. I am trading imaginary security for real happiness, and I consider that the best investment I could possibly make." The gossip that swirled through town was vicious and unrelenting. Mrs. Patterson held court at the general store, regaling anyone who would listen with theories about Eleanor's obvious mental breakdown. Dr. Hutchinson, the physician who had been courting Eleanor with determined persistence, proclaimed himself devastated by her obvious descent into hysteria. Even the minister felt compelled to call upon her, expressing concern for the state of her immortal soul. Through it all, Eleanor maintained a dignified silence about her specific plans. Let them speculate and condemn. Their opinions mattered less to her with each passing day. The only judgment that concerned her was Caleb's, and he had proven his acceptance by working alongside her to prepare for their shared future. Winter had settled over the mountains with the serious intent of a season that meant business. The snows that had seemed romantic and beautiful during Eleanor's courtship visits now revealed their true nature as both blessing and challenge. Caleb's cabin was well prepared for the onslaught. thick walls, a reliable roof, and stores of food and fuel that would see them through until spring. But Eleanor was learning that preparation and endurance were very different things. The isolation was profound in ways she hadn't anticipated. Days passed when the only human voices they heard were their own, when the world beyond their clearing might as well have ceased to exist. For someone accustomed to constant social interaction, even interaction she had grown to despise, the silence was initially overwhelming. But gradually Eleanor began to appreciate the peace that came with true solitude. Without the constant pressure to perform, to meet expectations, to maintain appearances, she found herself relaxing into a version of herself she had never known existed. Her laughter came more easily, her thoughts flowed more freely, and her conversations with Caleb developed a depth and intimacy that would have been impossible in the artificial environment of social propriety. They talked about everything during those long winter evenings. Their childhoods, their dreams, their fears, their hopes for the future they were building together. Caleb revealed more of himself than he had to anyone in years, sharing stories of his time in the war, his struggles to find peace afterward, and the gradual healing he had found in the honest challenges of mountain life. Eleanor, in turn, spoke candidly about the emptiness of her marriage to Edmund, her growing sense of suffocation in the role of society widow, and her wonder at discovering that she was capable of strength and courage she had never suspected. These conversations, held by firelight while snow piled against the windows, forged bonds between them that were stronger than any marriage ceremony could provide. It was during one of these intimate evenings that Eleanor brought up the subject that had been weighing on her mind since their mutual declaration of love. "I want to be your wife," she said simply, looking up from the mending in her lap. "Not just your partner or your companion, but your wife in every sense of the word. I want our children to bear your name and know that their parents chose love over convention." Caleb paused in his whittling, a small wooden toy taking shape under his skilled hands. "Marriage means different things to different people," he said carefully. "The legal ceremony, the church blessing, the community recognition, none of that's possible up here, at least not in the traditional sense." "I don't need traditional," Eleanor replied, setting aside her sewing to give him her full attention. "I need real. I need binding. I need something that makes us truly one unit, committed to each other, regardless of what anyone else thinks or says." Caleb met her gaze, seeing in her eyes the same determination that had brought her to his mountain in the first place. "There are ways," he said slowly. "Old ways from before churches and courthouses got involved in such matters, hand-fasting ceremonies that bind two people as completely as any official document." Eleanor felt her heart quicken with excitement and certainty. "Tell me." "It's simple in form, but profound in meaning," Caleb explained, warming to the subject. "Two people pledge themselves to each other before whatever witnesses they choose, God, nature, the spirits of the land. They bind their hands together, share bread and wine, exchange whatever vows their hearts dictate. The commitment is as real and lasting as any made in a cathedral." "When?" Eleanor asked, leaning forward with eager anticipation. Caleb smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face with warmth and love. "When the moon is full again, if you're certain. The next full moon falls on Christmas Eve. Seems appropriate for a new beginning." Eleanor's answer was to cross the space between them and kiss him with all the passion and promise she could convey. When they separated, both breathing hard, she could see the reflection of her own joy and anticipation in his pale blue eyes. "Christmas Eve it is," she whispered against his lips. "Mrs. Eleanor McCoy has a nice sound to it, don't you think?" The weeks that followed were filled with quiet preparation for their mountain wedding. Eleanor fashioned a simple dress from wool fabric she had brought from town, its deep blue color complementing her dark hair and green eyes. Caleb crafted matching rings from silver ore he had mined himself, simple bands without ornamentation but rich with personal meaning. They planned their ceremony for sunset on Christmas Eve, when the full moon would rise over the snow-covered peaks like a celestial blessing on their union. There would be no guests except the mountain itself, no music except the whisper of wind through pine boughs, no flowers except the evergreen sprays they would gather from the forest around their home. As the appointed day approached, Eleanor felt a peace and anticipation unlike anything she had experienced before either of her previous major life transitions. This choice was entirely her own, made not from duty or expectation, but from love and certainty about the path she wanted her life to take. On the night before their hand fasting, as they sat before the fire making final preparations for the ceremony, Eleanor removed the last symbol of her old life. She pulled a small velvet pouch from her belongings, emptying its contents into her palm, her original wedding ring, the one that had bound her to Edmund and to a life that had never truly fit her spirit. Without ceremony or regret, she walked to the cabin door and flung the ring into the snow, where it disappeared instantly beneath the white blanket that covered the mountains. The gesture felt like the final severing of ties to a past that no longer served her, the completion of a transformation that had begun with 5 bold words spoken on a mountain trail. Tomorrow, she would become Caleb's wife in the most meaningful way possible, not through legal documents or social ceremonies, but through the power of choice, commitment, and love that transcended all external validation. Tomorrow, Eleanor Hawthorne would cease to exist, and Eleanor McCoy would begin a life of authentic purpose and genuine partnership in the wild, beautiful country they would call home. Christmas Eve dawned clear and bitterly cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made every sound carry for miles and turned breath into clouds of vapor that hung motionless in the still atmosphere. Eleanor woke before sunrise, filled with a nervous energy that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with the significance of the day ahead. Today, she would marry Caleb McCoy in a ceremony of their own devising, pledging herself to a man and a life that represented everything she had ever dreamed of, but never dared to hope for. She had planned to spend the morning in quiet preparation, perhaps gathering the evergreen boughs they would use to mark their sacred space, but those plans were shattered by the sound of horses approaching through the snow. Eleanor rushed to the window, her heart sinking as she recognized the riders emerging from the tree line. 3 men from Copper Ridge, including Sheriff Morrison and Dr. Hutchinson, their faces grim with purpose beneath their frost-rimmed hat. "Brims! Caleb!" she called softly, knowing he would already be alert to the approaching danger. In the mountains, unexpected visitors usually meant trouble of one sort or another. Caleb appeared from the workshop, his expression carefully neutral, but his pale blue eyes sharp with wariness. He took in the scene beyond the window with the practiced assessment of a man who had survived by reading threats accurately and quickly. "Stay inside," he told Eleanor, reaching for his rifle. "Let me handle this." But Eleanor had no intention of hiding, while others made decisions about her life. She followed Caleb onto the porch, her chin raised with the stubborn determination that had carried her through every challenge since that first day on the mountain trail. Sheriff Morrison dismounted first, his breath steaming as he surveyed the cabin and its inhabitants. He was a political appointee rather than a lawman by nature, more comfortable with paperwork than confrontation, but he carried himself with the authority of his office. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said formally, touching the brim of his hat, "I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to come back to town with us." "On what grounds?" Eleanor replied calmly, though her heart was racing with alarm and indignation. Dr. Hutchinson urged his horse forward, his face flushed with cold and what appeared to be righteous anger. "Eleanor, this madness has gone on long enough. You're clearly not in your right mind, and as a medical professional, I have a duty to ensure you receive proper treatment." "My mind is perfectly clear, Dr. Hutchinson," Eleanor said, her voice sharp with contempt. "Clearer than it's been in years, in fact. Then how do you explain this?" The third rider, a lawyer Eleanor recognized but had never formally met, pulled a document from his coat. A petition signed by dozens of concerned citizens attesting to your erratic behavior and requesting a competency hearing. You've abandoned your home, liquidated valuable assets, and taken up residence with a known recluse in conditions that can only be described as primitive. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as the implications of the legal document sank in. If a judge declared her incompetent, everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed to build with Caleb, could be stripped away in a matter of legal proceedings. "You have no right," she began, but Sheriff Morrison cut her off. With a raised hand, "Mrs. Hawthorne, I have a legal obligation to ensure your welfare. Now you can come quietly, or I can arrest you for your own protection. Either way, you're coming back to town." It was then that Caleb stepped forward, and Eleanor saw something in his posture that made her breath catch in her throat. There was a stillness about him, a coiled readiness that spoke of violence barely held in check, but when he spoke, his voice was calm and measured. "Sheriff, you're on my land, threatening my woman. I'd suggest you reconsider your approach." Dr. Hutchinson's face darkened with fury. "Your woman?" This man has clearly taken advantage of Eleanor's vulnerable state, isolated her from her friends and family, and convinced her to abandon everything sensible and civilized. It's textbook manipulation by a predator. Eleanor started to object, but Caleb's next words stopped her cold. "Is that what you think, Doctor?" Caleb's voice had taken on a different quality, harder and more dangerous than Eleanor had ever heard from him. "That I'm some ignorant mountain savage who seduced a rich widow for her money?" He moved down the porch steps with fluid grace, and Eleanor noticed for the first time that his hand rested casually on the grip of a revolver she hadn't known he carried. "Let me tell you something about manipulation and advantage, since you seem so concerned about such things." Caleb's pale eyes, fixed on Dr. Hutchinson, with an intensity that made the physician shift uncomfortably in his saddle. "I spent 4 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, Doctor. Rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel before the war ended. Fought at Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Gettysburg. Commanded men, made decisions that determined whether hundreds of soldiers lived or died." Eleanor felt the world tilt beneath her feet as Caleb's words sank in. "Lieutenant colonel, Army Corps of Engineers." This was not the simple mountain man she had thought she knew and loved. "The Army taught me a lot of useful skills," Caleb continued, his voice deadly quiet. "How to build bridges and tear them down, how to read terrain and plan tactical movements, how to kill efficiently when necessary." His hand tightened on the revolver grip. "How to recognize when men with badges think they can intimidate someone, because they assume he's ignorant and helpless." Sheriff Morrison's face had gone pale beneath his mustache. "Now see here, McCoy." "No, Sheriff. You see here." Caleb's military bearing was fully evident now, command authority radiating from him like heat from a forge. The woman standing on that porch chose to be here. She wasn't coerced, manipulated, or taken advantage of. She made an informed decision to leave a life that was killing her spirit for one that allows her to become who she was meant to be. He took another step forward, and all 3 mounted men instinctively reached for their weapons. "You want to take her back to town against her will. You want to declare her incompetent for choosing love over money. Then you'd better be prepared for the consequences, because I didn't survive 4 years of war to let small-minded bureaucrats destroy the best thing that ever happened to me." The tension in the clearing was thick enough to cut, and Eleanor realized, with crystal clarity, that men were about to die over her right to choose her own life. The revelation of Caleb's hidden past had shaken her, but not nearly as much as the realization that he was prepared to fight and kill to protect what they had built together. "Caleb, stop!" Eleanor's voice cut through the dangerous stillness like a blade. She walked down the steps to stand beside him, her hand covering his on the revolver grip. "There's been enough violence in your life. Don't add more because of me." She turned to face the 3 men, her green eyes blazing with fierce determination. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your concern for my welfare, misguided though it may be. But I am a grown woman, in full possession of my faculties, and I have made my choice. If you wish to challenge my competency in court, you're welcome to try. But I will not be dragged anywhere against my will, and I will not allow you to threaten the man I love." Dr. Hutchinson's face was twisted with frustration and wounded pride. "Eleanor, you can't possibly understand what you're doing. This man has been lying to you, presenting himself as something he's not." "Have you?" Eleanor asked, turning to look at Caleb with eyes that demanded truth. "Have you been lying to me?" Caleb met her gaze steadily, his hand still resting on his weapon, but his voice gentle as he answered. "I never told you I was uneducated or simple, Eleanor. I told you I was a man who chose to live in the mountains, away from the complications of civilization. The reasons I chose that life, those are things I haven't shared with you yet, but they don't change who I am now or how I feel about you." Eleanor studied his face for a long moment, reading in his expression the pain of old wounds and the fear that she might turn away from him now that his secrets were exposed. Instead, she stepped closer, her hand moving from his weapon to his scarred cheek. "Then we'll talk about those reasons later," she said softly, "after we're married and after these gentlemen leave our property." The sheriff looked from Eleanor to Caleb and back again, clearly recognizing that he was facing two people who would not be moved by threats or legal posturing. The lawyer was studying his documents with the expression of a man realizing his case was far weaker than he had anticipated. Dr. Hutchinson alone seemed prepared to continue the confrontation. "This is madness, Eleanor. You're throwing your life away for a man who's been deceiving you from the beginning. The only deception here, Doctor, is your belief that you have any say in how I live my life." Eleanor's voice was cold as mountain ice. "You courted a wealthy widow who would enhance your social standing and financial prospects. I chose a man who sees me as a partner rather than a prize. If you can't understand the difference, then you understand nothing about love." With visible effort, Caleb holstered his revolver and stepped back, though his stance remained ready for trouble. "Sheriff, you and your friends are welcome to ride back to town and file whatever paperwork makes you feel better. But you're not taking Eleanor anywhere she doesn't want to go, and if you try, you'll discover that some mountains are too dangerous to climb." The three men exchanged glances, weighing their options against the clear determination of the couple facing them. After a long moment, Sheriff Morrison touched his hat brim in grudging acknowledgement. "This isn't over, Mrs. Hawthorne. The court will want to hear testimony about your mental state, and there will be consequences for your decisions." "I'm counting on it," Eleanor replied with calm confidence. "I look forward to explaining to a judge exactly why I chose authentic love over artificial respectability." As the three riders turned and made their way back through the snow toward town, Eleanor and Caleb stood together in the clearing, the silence heavy with unspoken questions and revelations. The man she had fallen in love with was not exactly who she had thought he was, but then again, neither was she. Perhaps that was fitting. Two people who had reinvented themselves, finding love and purpose in a place where the past mattered less than the future they were building together. The sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and rose. It was time for their wedding ceremony, time to pledge themselves to each other and to the life they had chosen, despite every obstacle society could place in their path. But first, they had truths to share and secrets to lay bare, because a marriage built on anything less than complete honesty would never survive the challenges that lay ahead. The confrontation with the men from town had shaken something loose between Eleanor and Caleb, creating a space where unspoken truths could finally find voice. As they stood in the gathering twilight, watching the riders disappear into the forest, Eleanor felt the weight of revelation settling around them like snow. The man she loved was not exactly who she had believed him to be, but then again, perhaps, none of them were entirely who they appeared to be. "We need to talk," Caleb said quietly, his military bearing still evident in the straight line of his shoulders and the alert tension in his stance. Before we go any further, before we make promises that will bind us together, you need to know the whole truth about who I am and why I came to these mountains. Eleanor nodded, recognizing the gravity in his voice. Whatever secrets he carried, they were significant enough to change everything or nothing, depending on her capacity for understanding and forgiveness. Then let's talk. We have all evening and I'm not going anywhere. They went inside the cabin where warmth and lamplight created an intimate space for difficult conversations. Caleb moved with restless energy, unable to settle, while Eleanor sat in one of his handmade chairs and waited for him to find the words he needed. I told those men the truth about my military service, he began, stopping before the fireplace and staring into the flames. Lieutenant Colonel Caleb McCoy, United States Army Corps of Engineers. I built bridges across rivers under enemy fire, designed fortifications that saved thousands of lives, and planned demolitions that destroyed supply lines and changed the course of battles. Eleanor listened without interruption, seeing in her mind's eye a younger version of the man she loved, uniformed, clean-shaven, carrying the weight of command and the burden of life and death decisions. I was good at it, Caleb continued, his voice hollow with old pain. Too good, maybe. The army kept promoting me, giving me more responsibility, more men under my command. By the end of the war, I was making decisions that affected thousands of soldiers and civilians. He turned from the fire to face her, and Eleanor saw in his pale blue eyes the haunted look of a man who had seen too much and done things that still cost him sleep. Fredericksburg was where it all started to go wrong. The brass had a plan, a stupid, suicidal plan that would have sent 12,000 men straight into Confederate artillery. I tried to argue, tried to propose alternatives, but orders were orders. Eleanor felt her heart clench as she began to understand the burden he carried. What did you do? I followed orders, built the bridges they told me to build, cleared the approach routes they specified, and watched wave after wave of good men die because politicians in Washington thought they understood warfare better than the soldiers fighting it. Caleb's hands clenched into fists at his sides. 12,000 casualties in a single day, Eleanor. 12,000 men who trusted their commanders to use their lives wisely. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of old grief and survivors. Guilt. Eleanor began to understand why Caleb had sought isolation in the mountains, why he had turned away from the world of men and their ambitions. After Fredericksburg, something broke inside me. Caleb continued. I kept doing my duty, kept building, and destroying and following orders, but I couldn't stop seeing the faces of those dead soldiers. At Gettysburg, when they asked me to survey positions for another frontal assault, I almost resigned my commission rather than enable another slaughter. But you didn't resign, Eleanor said gently, understanding beginning to dawn. No, because by then I'd figured out how to subvert the worst orders without technically disobeying them. I'd build bridges that could be destroyed quickly if retreat became necessary. I'd survey positions that favored defensive rather than offensive actions. I'd find ways to protect the men under my command while still appearing to follow the battle. In plans, Caleb began pacing again, the memories clearly agitating him despite the years that had passed. It worked mostly. We saved lives that would have been wasted on futile charges, but it also meant living a lie, pretending to support strategies I knew were wrong while secretly working to undermine them. Eleanor was beginning to see the full picture now, a man of conscience, trapped in an impossible situation, forced to choose between his duty as a soldier and his responsibility to the men he commanded. The war ended, but the guilt didn't. How could it? Caleb's voice was rough with emotion. I'd spent 4 years watching good men die for bad reasons, and even when I managed to save some of them, it never felt like enough. When the fighting finally stopped and they offered me a permanent commission, a chance to help rebuild the country, all I could think about was getting as far away from human ambition and stupidity as possible." He stopped pacing and looked directly at Eleanor, his expression vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. "So I came here, to a place where the only battles are with nature and the only casualties are the result of my own mistakes. I thought I could find peace in isolation, thought I could outrun the memories and the guilt by building a life that didn't depend on anyone else." Eleanor rose from her chair and moved toward him, understanding flooding through her like a warm tide. "But you couldn't outrun it, could you? The guilt, the sense of responsibility, the need to protect people you care about." "No," Caleb admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "And when you appeared in my life, when I started to care about you, all those protective instincts came rushing back. That's why I was so resistant to letting you stay, Eleanor. Not because I didn't want you here, but because I was terrified of failing to keep you safe the way I failed to keep those soldiers safe." Eleanor reached out and took his scarred hands in hers, feeling the calluses and old wounds that told the story of his transformation from military officer to mountain man. "You didn't fail those soldiers, Caleb. You saved as many as you could, while working within an impossible system. And you haven't failed me either, haven't I?" Caleb's eyes searched her face desperately. "Today, when those men came for you, my first instinct was violence. I was ready to kill them rather than let them take you away, and that terrifies me. What if I can't control those instincts? What if the man I became in the war is stronger than the man I've tried to become since?" Eleanor stepped closer, close enough to see the fear and self-doubt warring in his expression. "The man you became in the war was trying to protect people he cared about. The man you are now was doing exactly the same thing. That's not something to be ashamed of, Caleb. That's something to be proud of." She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with infinite tenderness. "You think your past makes you unworthy of love, but you're wrong. Your past makes you the man I fell in love with, someone who understands sacrifice. Someone who will fight for what matters, someone who knows the true cost of the choices we make." Caleb leaned into her touch, his eyes closing as if he were a man dying of thirst, finally offered water. "I wanted to tell you before, but I was afraid you'd see me differently, afraid you'd realize you'd fallen in love with an illusion. The only illusion was thinking that your past could change how I feel about you," Eleanor said firmly. "I fell in love with your strength, your integrity, your capacity for gentleness, despite everything you've endured. Learning about your military. Service doesn't diminish those qualities, it explains them." Eleanor pulled a bundle of papers from the pocket of her dress, legal documents that she had been carrying with her since her last trip to town. "Speaking of revelations, I have something to show you too. Something that makes today's confrontation even more significant than you realize." Caleb opened his eyes and focused on the papers, his brow furrowing with confusion. "What are these?" "The final transfer documents for my property sales and the establishment of a trust fund that will ensure we never have to worry about money again." Eleanor's voice held quiet satisfaction. "But more importantly, they're also my formal petition to the territorial court for recognition of our marriage under common law statutes." Caleb's eyes widened as he scanned the legal language. "You filed for legal recognition of a marriage that hasn't happened yet? I filed for recognition of a marriage that began the moment I declared my intentions on that mountain trail," Eleanor corrected. "The ceremony we're planning tonight is just the spiritual confirmation of what we both already know to be true." She pointed to specific passages in the documents. "Under territorial law, cohabitation combined with mutual declaration of intent constitutes a legal marriage. The fact that I've been living here regularly, that I've publicly declared my intention to be your wife, and that we've conducted ourselves as a married couple gives us the same legal standing as any church wedding." Caleb stared at the papers with amazement and growing comprehension. "This means This means that when Sheriff Morrison and his friends try to challenge my competency, they'll discover that I'm no longer Eleanor Hawthorne, wealthy widow whose decisions can be questioned by concerned citizens. I'm Eleanor McCoy, legally married woman whose husband has every right to protect her from unwanted interference. A slow smile spread across Caleb's face, the first genuine smile Eleanor had seen from him since the confrontation earlier. You magnificent, devious woman. You've outmaneuvered them completely. I learned from the best, Eleanor replied, gesturing toward the military medals she had noticed among his carefully stored possessions. My husband is apparently something of an expert in tactical planning. The word husband hung in the air between them, transforming the atmosphere from one of revelation and uncertainty to one of joy and anticipation. The legal maneuvering was important, but it paled in comparison to the emotional significance of what they were about to undertake. So tonight's ceremony, Caleb began. Tonight's ceremony is for us, Eleanor finished. Not for the law, not for society, not for anyone else, just for us, to mark the beginning of our life together as partners in every sense of the word. Caleb set the papers aside and pulled Eleanor into his arms, holding her with a fierce tenderness that spoke of gratitude and relief and love too deep for words. I love you, Eleanor McCoy. I love your courage, your determination, your ability to see solutions where I see only problems. And I love you, Caleb McCoy. All of you, the soldier, the mountain man, the craftsman, the protector, every part of your past that brought you to this moment, to this place, to me. They held each other as the last light faded from the sky and the full moon began to rise over the eastern peaks. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside the cabin, two people who had found each other against all odds, prepared to pledge their lives to a future built on honesty, trust, and unshakable love. The ceremony they had planned was simple, in form but profound in meaning. They would bind their hands together with strips of leather blessed with pine oil, exchange rings crafted from mountain silver, and speak vows that came from their hearts rather than from prayer books. The only witnesses would be the stars overhead and the endless wilderness that had brought them together. As they prepared for their mountain wedding, Eleanor felt a deep sense of rightness settling into her bones. This was exactly where she was meant to be, exactly who she was meant to be with. The challenges that lay ahead, legal battles, social condemnation, the everyday struggles of frontier life, seemed insignificant compared to the strength they had found in each other. The full moon rose like a blessing over their chosen sanctuary, painting the snow-covered clearing in silver light that made the entire world seem magical and new. It was time to step into their future together, time to become officially what they had already known themselves to be, partners, equals, two halves of a whole that was stronger than either could be alone. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they would face it together as husband and wife, bound not just by legal documents, but by the deeper ties of choice, commitment, and love that could weather any storm the world might send their way. The moonlight transformed the clearing into a cathedral of silver and shadow, where every snowflake seemed to hang suspended like scattered diamonds, and the silence held a reverence that no earthly church could match. Eleanor stood before the small mirror in Caleb's cabin, putting the finishing touches on her appearance for the most important ceremony of her life. The simple blue wool dress she had sewn for the occasion fit her perfectly, its deep color bringing out the green of her eyes and the dark richness of her hair, which she had arranged in a simple braid woven with sprigs of evergreen. Caleb emerged from the workshop carrying something wrapped in soft leather, the rings he had crafted from silver, or mined in the mountains behind their home. When he unwrapped them, Eleanor gasped at their simple beauty. They were perfectly round, polished to a gentle glow that caught the lamplight, and inscribed on the inner surface with their initials intertwined with a small pine tree, symbol of the wilderness that had brought them together. "They're beautiful," Eleanor whispered, taking the smaller ring and holding it up to the light. "Perfect. Like you," Caleb replied, his voice rough with emotion. He had changed into his best clothes, a white shirt he had kept stored in cedar, dark wool trousers, and a vest that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. His hair was neatly combed, his beard trimmed, and despite the simple setting, he looked every inch the commanding officer he had once been. Together, they gathered the other elements they would need for their ceremony. Caleb had baked bread earlier in the day, a loaf that filled the cabin with the warm scent of yeast and grain. Eleanor had prepared a simple meal that would serve as their wedding feast: venison stew, wild berry preserves, and the bottle of wine she had been saving for this moment. They bundled everything in a blanket and stepped out into the moonlit clearing. The spot they had chosen for their ceremony was a natural circle of flat stones beside the creek that provided their water. Caleb had cleared the snow away earlier, revealing the dark granite beneath, and now he arranged pine boughs to mark the sacred space, while Eleanor unpacked their simple altar on a flat boulder that would serve as their table. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the evergreen branches and the soft murmur of water moving beneath a thin skin of ice. Eleanor felt her heart beating fast with nervous excitement as she looked around at the wild beauty that surrounded them, snow-covered peaks rising like ancient sentinels against the star-filled sky, forest stretching endlessly in all directions, and above it all the full moon, blessing their union with silver light. "Are you ready?" Caleb asked, moving to stand beside her in the circle of stones. Eleanor looked at him, this man who had saved her from a runaway horse, and in doing so had saved her from a life of meaningless comfort. This soldier who had fought for what he believed in and found peace in the wilderness. This craftsman who had built not just a cabin but a sanctuary where love could grow wild and free. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life." They began with the words they had agreed upon, simple vows that came from their hearts rather than from any tradition or ceremony book. Caleb spoke first, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Eleanor, when you rode into my life with your bold words and your fearless spirit, you brought light into a darkness I thought would never lift. You saw in me not just the broken soldier hiding in the mountains, but the man I could become with, the right partner beside me. I promised to love you, to protect you, to work beside you in building a life worthy of the courage it took to find each other." Eleanor felt tears freezing on her cheeks as she spoke her own vows. "Caleb, you taught me what it means to be truly alive, to choose love over safety and authentic purpose over comfortable emptiness. You showed me that I was stronger than I ever imagined, braver than I ever dared to be. I promise to love you, to stand with you against whatever challenges come, to build with you a family and a legacy that will honor the wilderness that brought us together." Caleb produced the leather strips they would use for the hand-fasting, soft deerskin that he had prepared with pine oil and blessed with prayers to whatever gods watched over lovers and dreamers. He bound their hands together, right to right, left to left, while speaking the ancient words that transformed two separate people into one united partnership. "As our hands are bound together now, so our lives become intertwined. As this leather connects us, so our hearts are joined forever. What the mountains have brought together, let no human law or social convention tear apart." The rings came next, each placed on the other's finger with reverent care. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as Caleb slipped the silver band onto her ring finger, but not from cold or nervousness, from the overwhelming rightness of the moment. The sense that everything in her life had been leading to this instant, under the full moon, in a clearing far from civilization. "With this ring, I thee wed," Caleb said, his pale blue eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the rest of the world disappear. "In the sight of God and nature, with the mountains as our witness and the stars as our blessing. With this ring I thee wed," Eleanor replied, sliding his ring into place over the scarred knuckles that told the story of his journey from war to peace. For as long as we both shall live, and in whatever lies beyond. They shared bread next, breaking the loaf Caleb had baked and feeding each other with the tenderness of a sacrament. The simple grain became a symbol of the life they would build together: honest work, shared sustenance, the daily miracles of survival and love in a place where both required constant attention and mutual support. The wine followed, passed between them in a simple tin cup that had served Caleb through years of solitary meals. But tonight it became a chalice, blessing their union with the ancient ritual of shared drink that bound couples together across cultures and centuries. As Eleanor drank, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, the empty years of her first marriage, the restless dissatisfaction that had driven her to seek something more, the wild ride that had put her in Caleb's path just when she needed him most. Every step had been necessary. Every choice had led her closer to this man and this life. When the formal elements of the ceremony were complete, Caleb untied the leather strips that bound their hands, but the connection remained. They were married. Now in every way that mattered, legally, spiritually, emotionally, Eleanor McCoy at last, partner to a man who saw her as she truly was and loved her for it. "My wife," Caleb said wonderingly, as if testing the words on his tongue. "My husband," Eleanor replied, the title settling around her like a mantle of belonging she had never known she needed. They stood together in their circle of stones as the moon reached its zenith overhead. Two people who had found in each other everything they had been missing. The ceremony was over, but the celebration was just beginning. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges: legal battles, social condemnation, the endless work of frontier survival. But tonight belonged to them alone. Hand in hand, they walked back toward the cabin that was now truly their home, ready to begin their married life in the way lovers had done since the beginning of time. The full moon blessed their passage, and the mountains themselves seemed to whisper their approval of a union that honored both passion and practicality, love and commitment, the wild freedom of nature and the deeper bonds that make two people into one unbreakable whole. Spring came late to the high country, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it a transformation that went far beyond the melting snow and budding aspen. Eleanor stood in the doorway of their cabin, one hand resting on her rounded belly, watching Caleb work in the garden he had expanded to accommodate their growing needs. The morning sickness had passed, replaced by an energy and vitality that made her feel more alive than ever before. 6 months had passed since their mountain wedding, 6 months during which their love had deepened and their partnership had proven itself against every challenge the wilderness could offer. The legal battles they had expected never materialized. Eleanor's strategic planning had made any court challenge impossible, and the gossips of Copper Ridge had eventually found new scandals to occupy their attention. Dr. Hutchinson had left town entirely, seeking easier conquests in the territorial capital, and Sheriff Morrison had developed a sudden respect for the legal complexities of mountain jurisdiction. But the most profound change was growing beneath Eleanor's heart. The first of the sons she had so boldly predicted on that autumn day, when she had shocked Caleb with her audacious declaration. The baby was due in late summer, and Caleb had thrown himself into preparations with the same methodical precision he had once applied to military engineering. The cradle he had carved in secret was now complete and positioned beside their bed, its smooth maple surfaces glowing with oil finish and ready to receive its first occupant. He had expanded the cabin with a new room that would serve as a nursery, complete with handmade furniture and windows positioned to catch the morning sun. Most importantly, he had spent the winter months learning everything he could about midwifery and infant care, preparing for the possibility that they might need to deliver their child without outside assistance. "The radishes are coming up nicely," Caleb called, looking up from his weeding with a smile that transformed his weathered face. "Should have fresh vegetables by midsummer." Eleanor laughed. marveling at how domestic concerns had replaced the loneliness and restlessness that had once defined her existence. "Good. This little one seems to have strong opinions about what I should be eating." She joined him in the garden, moving carefully but confidently despite her changing condition. Pregnancy had agreed with her in ways that surprised them both. Her complexion glowed with health, her hair had grown thick and lustrous, and her figure had taken on the ripe curves of approaching motherhood. More importantly, she had adapted to the physical demands of frontier life with a resilience that impressed even Caleb. "Any word from Pete Miller about the supplies we ordered?" Eleanor asked, settling beside him on the wooden stool he had crafted. "For her garden work. Should be here within the week," Caleb replied, his hands gentle as he helped her position herself comfortably. "Including those medical texts you wanted and the additional fabric for baby clothes." Eleanor nodded with satisfaction. They had planned carefully for the birth, ordering supplies and information that would ensure they were prepared for any contingency. The isolation that had once seemed romantic now carried practical implications that required serious consideration. But neither of them regretted their choice to raise their child in the mountains. It was while they worked together in companionable silence that Eleanor felt the first unmistakable movement, a flutter of life beneath her ribs that made her gasp with wonder and joy. Caleb was beside her instantly, his expression shifting from concern to amazement as she guided his hand to the spot where their child was making its presence known. "Strong," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion as he felt the tiny movements, already eager to explore the world. "Just like his parents," Eleanor said softly, covering Caleb's hand with her own. Bold and determined and unwilling to accept limitations, they sat together in their mountain garden, hands linked over the life they had created, surrounded by the wild beauty that had brought them together and would shape their child's understanding of what was possible in the world. The moment felt sacred, a confirmation of everything they had chosen and sacrificed to build their unconventional family. As summer progressed, Eleanor's pregnancy advanced with encouraging normalcy. She remained active and healthy, helping with the harvest, preserving food for winter, and preparing the clothes and supplies their baby would need. Caleb was attentive without being overprotective, recognizing that Eleanor's strength was one of the qualities he most admired about her. The labor began on a clear August morning, when the mountain air was crisp with the promise of autumn. Eleanor woke with the deep, rhythmic pains that announced the arrival of their child, and within hours, Caleb had transformed their cabin into a birthing room with the efficiency of a field surgeon preparing for battle. The process was long and difficult, as first births often are, but Eleanor met each contraction with the same determination she had brought to every other challenge in her mountain life. Caleb supported her with steady hands and encouraging words, drawing on everything he had learned about childbirth and applying it with the calm competence that had made him a successful military leader. When their son finally arrived, red-faced and furious at being expelled from his warm sanctuary, his first cry echoed off the cabin walls like a victory trumpet. Eleanor laughed through her exhaustion as Caleb placed the squirming infant on her chest, marveling at the perfect tiny fingers and the shock of dark hair that marked him unmistakably as his father's child. "Thomas," Eleanor said softly, naming their son after Caleb's father, who had died when Caleb was young. Thomas Edmund McCoy. Caleb's eyes filled with tears as he looked at his son, healthy, strong, and already showing signs of the stubborn independence that had brought his parents together. "Perfect," he whispered. "Absolutely perfect." As Eleanor nursed their newborn for the first time, she thought about the bold prediction she had made over a year ago on a mountain trail. "We are having sons." The first part of that prophecy had been fulfilled, and she had no doubt that more children would follow as the years passed. Their family had begun in the most unconventional way possible, but it was founded on the strongest possible foundation: love that had overcome every obstacle, partnership that had been tested by hardship and proven unbreakable, and a shared vision of life lived on their own terms in a place where freedom and authenticity were more valuable than social approval or material comfort. Outside their cabin, the mountains stood eternal and welcoming, ready to teach another generation about strength, resilience, and the wild beauty of a life lived close to nature. Thomas McCoy would grow up knowing that love could conquer any obstacle, that courage was more valuable than conformity, and that the most important things in life couldn't be bought with money. They had to be built with determination, defended with strength, and nurtured with the kind of unwavering commitment his parents had shown each other from their very first meeting on a dangerous mountain trail. 5 years had passed since Eleanor Hawthorne had first declared her audacious intentions to a startled mountain man, and the clearing where Caleb's cabin stood had been transformed into something that looked more like a small homestead than a hermit's retreat. A second cabin had been built to accommodate their growing family, connected to the original by a covered walkway that provided protection during the harsh winter months. Gardens flourished where once there had been only wilderness, and the sound of children's laughter echoed off the mountainsides that had known only silence for so long. Eleanor sat on the expanded porch, nursing their youngest son while watching 4-year-old Thomas and 2-year-old Samuel play with wooden toys their father had carved. Her prediction had proven prophetic in ways that still amazed her. 3 sons so far, with the possibility of more children in the years ahead. Each boy bore the unmistakable stamp of his father's strong features and his mother's determined spirit, and all of them thrived in the mountain environment that challenged and nurtured them in equal measure. Caleb emerged from the workshop where he had been crafting furniture for a trading post commission, his success as a woodworker having grown to the point where orders came from as far away as Denver. His face bore the satisfaction of work well done, and his eyes held the deep contentment of a man who had found his purpose in life. The haunted look that had shadowed his features during their early days together had been replaced by the peaceful, in confidence of someone who had made his peace with both past and future. "The Morrison order is finished," he announced, settling beside Eleanor and reaching out to stroke the downy head of their infant son, David. "Should bring enough to see us through the winter and then some." Eleanor smiled, thinking about how far they had come from those early days when Caleb's isolation had been complete and her wealth had felt like a burden rather than a blessing. They had found a balance that honored both independence and prosperity, building a life that was both self-sufficient and connected to the wider world through trade and occasional visits to town. "Mrs. Patterson stopped by the trading post last week," Eleanor said with gentle amusement. "Pete says she asked after the crazy widow who went native and seemed almost disappointed to learn that we're prospering rather than suffering for our unconventional choices." Caleb chuckled, the sound rich with affection and shared understanding. "Some people need others to fail in order to feel better about their own compromises. Mrs. Patterson never could understand that we didn't see our choices as sacrifices." Their oldest son, Thomas, looked up from his play with the serious expression that made him seem older than his years. "Papa, tell us again about how Mama rode up the mountain to marry you." Eleanor and Caleb exchanged glances, remembering the many times they had been asked to recount the story of their courtship. It had become something of a family legend, embellished with each telling, but always true to the essential spirit of courage and determination that had brought them together. "Well," Caleb began, his voice taking on the storytelling cadence that never failed to capture his son's attention, "your mama was the bravest woman in the whole territory, but she was also the most stubborn. She decided she was going to marry me whether I liked it or not, and she wasn't going to let a little thing like me, living on top of a mountain, stop her." "Tell about the bear," Samuel demanded, bouncing with excitement. Eleanor laughed, remembering the morning when she had helped Caleb face down the hungry black bear that had threatened their food stores. That incident had become the boy's favorite. part of the story, representing their mother's courage and their parents' ability to work together against any challenge. The bear was enormous, Eleanor continued the familiar tale, bigger than our cabin and twice as mean. But your papa knew exactly what to do, and I knew exactly how to help him, because that's what partners do. They watch out for each other and face danger together. Young David gurgled contentedly in her arms, too young to understand the words, but soothed by the familiar rhythm of his parents' voices. Eleanor looked down at his peaceful face and marveled at how completely her life had been transformed. The restless, empty woman who had stood at her bedroom window 5 years ago, yearning for something she couldn't name, seemed like a character from someone else's story. "Are we going to live here forever?" Thomas asked, the question holding the practical curiosity of a child who was beginning to understand that families made choices about where and how to live. "As long as the mountains will have us," Caleb replied, his arm tightening around Eleanor's shoulders. "This is our home, boys. The place where your mother and I chose to build something real and lasting together." Eleanor nodded, her eyes taking in the view that never failed to inspire her. Snow-capped peaks reaching toward an endless sky, forests that changed color with the seasons, and the clear creek that provided both practical necessity and endless beauty. This wilderness had been their sanctuary, their testing ground and their blessing. In the distance, she could see the simple wooden cross that marked the spot where they had held their mountain wedding ceremony 5 years ago. They returned there every Christmas Eve to renew their vows and remember the moonlit night when they had pledged themselves to each other and to the life they would build together. It had become another family tradition, a way of honoring both their love story and the natural cathedral that had blessed their union. As evening approached and the boys were called in for supper, Eleanor found herself sketching in the journal she had kept throughout their mountain years. The crude map she had drawn during her first attempts to find Caleb's cabin had evolved into a detailed record of their life together. Sketches of the children as they grew, drawings of the expanding homestead, and written observations about the rhythms of mountain life that had become as familiar to her as breathing. Tonight's sketch showed their family gathered on the porch in the golden light of sunset, 3 boys playing at their parents' feet while the mountains stood guard around. Their chosen sanctuary. It was a simple scene, domestic and peaceful, but it represented everything Eleanor had dreamed of when she had made her bold declaration to a startled mountain man on an autumn trail. "You should prepare, mountain man, we are having sons," she had said, and every word had proven prophetic. Caleb had indeed prepared for fatherhood, for partnership, for a life shared with someone who understood that the greatest adventures weren't found in distant places, but in the courage to choose love over convention and authentic purpose over comfortable emptiness. As the stars emerged over their mountain home, Eleanor felt the deep satisfaction of a life well lived and a love that had grown stronger with each passing season. Their sons would grow up knowing that anything was possible for those brave enough to reach for it, that love could indeed move mountains, and that the most valuable inheritance wasn't money or property, but the example of 2 people who had dared to build something beautiful together in the wild, honest country where dreams became reality for those strong enough to make them come true. The mountains had given them everything they had hoped for and more: love, family, purpose, and the enduring knowledge that they had chosen well when they chose each other. Their story would continue to unfold with each new season, each new challenge, each new blessing. But the foundation they had built together would remain unshakable, rooted as deeply in the mountain soil as the ancient pines that had watched over their unconventional courtship and would stand guard over their children's children in the years to come.